But if the seminaries are not producing people that are more loving and gentle and just and compassionate and honest and faithful, we just got big plants and no fruit. We measure the vitality of our churches and our denominations and our institutions by the size of the church buildings and the size of the memberships and the budgets and the land holdings and the splendor of the campuses and the buildings. Every preacher has to have a building program. And every congregation wants to have a new building. As if God really put us in the world to produce budgets and buildings and hang our names on them and say, look what we gave you, God. God expects divine grace and truth to produce something much more and better than churches and cathedrals, no matter how good they look, better than buildings and budgets, no matter how big they are. Membership rolls and baptismal records are plants. Plants are what you get from seeds. You have to have plants to get fruit from them. But if you don't get any fruit from the plants aren't fruit. Farmers don't sow to harvest plants. Farmers sow looking to harvest a crop. Farming is determined by crop yields, not by the number or the size of the plants in a field. And whenever farmers see fields full of seasoned plants but can't find fruit from what's been planted, they know something is bad wrong.
Yes, sir. Amen.
There's something wrong in a world full of wars conducted with weapons sold by people who claim to be seasoned in divine grace and truth. There's something wrong in a society where poor people and children and the elderly and disabled see their services threatened, and while wealthy people get protection from paying more taxes by people who claim to be following God.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
There's something terribly wrong in a society where people who are different can't be protected from hate crimes and bigotry and discrimination and other injustice because people who claim to be seasoned in divine grace and truth won't demand and provide justice for them. There's something awfully wrong when God's will isn't being done in homes and neighborhoods and states and nations and across the world, while people who claim to be seasoned in divine grace and truth are continually building and grooming more places to build and clean up and pay for and brag about. Crop failure is always wrong if you're a farmer and you know anything about what a crop is supposed to look like. And Jesus said that crop failure is guaranteed. Whenever seeds are planted and rooted and become mature in a field full of weeds. So let me just break it down for you. We live in a war-torn world because people who claim to be seasoned in divine grace and truth have become strangled by illusions about getting more and wanting everything for themselves under the sun. And so when they don't get what they want, they fight wars about it. It boils down to the old childhood game. Child A sees child B with a toy. Child A wants the toy. Child B doesn't give him the toy. Child A says, I'm going to take the toy. Turn child A into a country. Give child A a military. Child A says, hey, I'm going to take the toy. I'm going to send folks to take the toy. Crop failure. We live in a world where people are poor and children who are poor and elderly are disabled and immigrants are threatened and vulnerable because people who claim to be disabled, claim to be seasoned by divine grace and truth, have become strangled by weeds about worry about getting enough for themselves. Well, they actually have enough for themselves. They got 2 or 3 cars and a boat And, you know, they got money to spare, and they have so much stuff they have to have yard sales of stuff that they don't want so they can go to the store and buy some stuff to replace the store stuff they've taken out of their closet to sell. In the meantime, folks are starving and begging who don't have enough. And then we leave the yard sale and go to church. People around the world are threatened financially today because people who claim to be seasoned in divine grace and truth are more interested in global markets and corporate profits and personal wealth for the rich and comfortable than they are about how business policies and decisions and practices affect the least among us. So we don't care how the person who has nothing is doing as long as the person whose stock is in the stock market is getting a profit. And you understand, if the person gets the profit by lying and selling something that's worth nothing and getting other folks to buy it, then what we'll do is we'll help the person who lied rather than the person who has been lied to and bought junk. We live in an addicted world because people who claim to be seasoned in divine grace and truth are being strangled by worries and illusions. And you know what? In many cases, the illusions are being devised and manufactured and sold by people who claim to be seasoned in divine grace and truth. That's what the prosperity gospel is. You understand? I'm going to sell you that you can go to heaven if you just get enough money. If you love the Lord will bless you. Sow seeds into my ministry, and the Lord will bless you. And the Lord, the more the Lord bless you, the more seeds you sow in my ministry, because the Lord blesses you to be a blessing to my ministry. And in the meantime, while you blessing my ministry, we're keeping folks out of the ministry who need to be helped. Weed control matters because weeds strangle the growth a plant that is otherwise healthy needs to produce a crop. And God deserves a crop, not plants, from the people who claim to be planted and rooted and seasoned in divine grace and truth. God deserves a just world. God deserves a peaceful world. God deserves a loving world. God deserves a gentle world. God deserves a faithful world. God deserves a generous world. God deserves a joyful world. God doesn't deserve plants. And shame on us who claim to be planted and rooted and seasoned in divine grace and truth if we are satisfied with buildings and budgets and membership rolls and religious services and the grandeur of all that. Maybe we've been in the weeds so long we've forgotten what God expects out of a crop. Maybe we have been around the weeds so long we've forgotten that if plants don't produce crops, they are just weeds for God. No farmer plants a crop expecting weeds, and no farmer expects a crop from weeds. Weeds can't produce a crop because they are weeds. Plants that are growing among weeds won't produce a crop. You understand the difference? Weeds can't. Plants in weeds won't. There's a difference. No matter what you do to weeds, you can't get corn out of it. But if you got corn stalks growing around weeds, you're not going to get good, as we used to call it back home, roasting ears. You're not going to get good corn out of it because the weeds will strangle the plant. They'll just stand in the field, planted and rooted and seasoned and fruitless. And when the harvest comes, you know what? The farmer cuts the plant and the weeds. The farmer discards the plants and the weeds. You know, because if the weeds produce no fruit, they're not any good to the farmer. As a matter of fact, if they produce no fruit, they don't even produce seed for new planting. And that pretty much describes the impact of religion in the world, doesn't it? We just keep recycling plants. Well, what's the good news, preacher? I got some good news for you. First good news is that God gives us time to work on weed control. If you want to know what's God doing about it, God has given us time. The reason you and I are still here is because God said, listen, I'm going to put off the harvest because I can't get anything out of this right now. I'm going to put off the harvest and see if we can get a little bit more out of this. If we give them time, and maybe they'll get their hose out. Maybe they'll put their gloves on and start pulling some weeds. If I give them a little more time, maybe they'll get tired of ringing around the weeds and will realize, oops, we're really supposed to be doing something besides having membership drives and budgets. What's the good news, preacher? Well, Jesus has shown us what God expects out of a plant. Because in Jesus, we have seen what fruit's supposed to look like. In Jesus, we have seen what God's fruit is supposed to do. We don't have an excuse. We know what fruit's supposed to do in the world. We know what fruit's supposed to look like in the world. We know how fruit's supposed to act in the world. So we have time. We have Jesus as an example. The sun. You know, plants grow towards the light. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. We grow towards the light. But if you got weeds, you just growing toward the light in the weeds. Shame on us if we'd rather grow weeds than fruit for God. Shame on us if we aren't aggressively guarding against weed growth. Shame on us if all we want to be is big, pretty plants surrounded by weeds. And shame on us if we don't think that God knows the difference between what we are and what God expects the field to yield. Amen.